So, hi, I'm Adam, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. It looks like a great turnout, and I'd like to thank Sean and the Meadows Museum for having me down. I'll go ahead and jump in and start telling you guys a little bit about my work. So, as an artist and filmmaker, I'm really fascinated by humanity's geomorphological agency within the landscape. Our appetite for resources, for design, and for comfort have made us arguably the largest force that sculpts the earth. And the Gunnison Bay in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, which is what you see here, it offers a really unique, large-scale opportunity to examine the effects that man-made structures have had on the earth. So the extreme salinity in the region is a result of the lake being divided into two distinctly different bodies of water. And this was caused by the construction of a 12-mile railroad causeway that essentially divides the lake in half. So since the northern portion of the lake was completely cut off from the fresh water sources that feed into the lake, as time passed, the salinity grew to such levels that almost nothing could survive, except for the red algae and sulfur bacteria, which is what gives the lake that surreal color. So what you're seeing are actually excerpts from a cinematic meditation that I created for my Echo project. And Echo is a series of experimental films, installations, cinematic meditations, but all of them sort of document and explore our often tumultuous and strained relationship with the landscape. And I try to do this by developing a space for contemplation. Really a space where the viewer can spend some time and examine this relationship and the anthropogenic traces that humanity leaves on the landscape via the cinematic apparatus and immersion. And the project that's actually opening upstairs here at the museum, Silent Forest Return, is also a part of this Echo project, and it's part of the series. So as a storyteller, I am really heavily interested in both experiential and traditional methods of narration through observation. I often take the viewer places through association, through composition and time. In many ways, I try to create works that focus on humanity, but yet have no traditional characters or actors in them. Rather, an experimental documentary work that offers a transcendent or encounter with the surreal and the uncanny relationship that we humanity have to place. And I was able to spend some time in that region filming that really surreal landscape through aerial cinematography. I can honestly say that standing on those watery fringes, the edges of that space, is one of the most alien landscapes I'd ever seen, and a really very haunting and sublime sort of evidence of just how much change a single simple intervention can create. All right, just a note for anybody who's into art history, that piece was filmed just south of Spiral Jetty, which was exposed while we were on location filming. So I, of course, had to make a small pilgrimage to see the piece because it was a piece that had very much influenced the way I thought about space, but it was a piece I'd only ever experienced through the textbook or online images. And if you ever find yourself, for some reason, out in the desert in Utah, in the northern part of Salt Lake, I strongly recommend making the journey out there and seeing the piece for yourself and walking the full space, because it's a very different experience than when you're looking at it in a textbook. All right, back to what I was talking about. So as an image maker, I really specialize in embedding within environments and spaces. And those can often be fragile and shifting or extreme and volatile. And I do all of this in an effort to capture moments with a very minimal impact on the location or the subject. And the nature of my work often takes me through a lot of multiple engagements with a space or a landscape. And there's a deep investment within site research and locational identity. There's a great amount of effort and labor that goes into site scouting and working on location in search of this surreal or the uncanny. And in many ways, for me, this journey, this labor is very much a part of the work and it's really an integral part. It helps to reinforce its relationship to the real and to site specificity. And I've been privileged to have stood in some of the most surreal spaces, exploring our relationship to the earth and what it truly means to be human, but not as an ecologist or a scientist. I'm doing that as an artist. To see firsthand how we fit into this natural world, into these larger systems, and doing so as an artist, I try to give the viewer a small glimpse into those changes and those changes our ambition can create. And another way that I kind of approach these projects are through public works, temporary public installations and festivals. And the project that you're seeing right now is actually titled Roots, and it was a temporary public sort of monument that used expanded cinema and projection to reposition this kind of natural imagery back into the architectural or urban environment. But I didn't want to do it, when I was approached to do the project, I didn't want to just do like a projection mapping project that you've kind of seen for ads. But of course it is built around a lot of that technology and those techniques. But I wanted to create really a theater to explore a more memory-like interpretation of the landscape that was lost to development. And this work was actually commissioned by the Baum Gallery at UCA for ArtsFest X, which was back in September 2016. And essentially the piece placed two portals within that public space. And it filled it with this meditative, glowing imagery. And Roots really examines that relationship between what we consider a developed space and what we consider a natural landscape. And the way the installation was designed, you could approach the screens from the front because they were rear projection, and you would never break into the image. You would actually be able to get this very intimate viewing distance. So the pixel density needed to hold up to be able to hold up to that kind of intimacy. Because the scale of the work would be kind of what caught the viewer's eye, but really what would draw them in to let them spend time with the work was that discrete detail and the timing, because it was a very slow kind of meditative evolution within the piece. And it's kind of an interesting side note about the project is just to the, I guess, right side of the images, the installation was this kind of very active bar. This was like in like an arts district kind of downtown area. And the night before the festival, we had the installation up and we're running it and we're making sure everything's working. And the patrons of that bar keep leaving the bar, and this is obviously like a kind of a route to where they park or where they're going home. And they would kind of stop dead in their tracks because there was nothing there the day before, and then today now there are these two portals, and there's no one around, and we're kind of watching from the other side of the street. And they would stop, and a few of them even sat down and watched the piece like go through its full cycle a few times. And I really found that interaction with the public that was like an unknowing public quite powerful, and I was really inspired by that. Of course, the festival where people knew it was supposed to be there and showed up for it, that was also really interesting too. But those moments where people would just stop alone in this empty space, this empty lot, and just sit with the work, I really found that inspiring. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. Let me jump ahead and talk about a little bit different of a project, but that's very much in line with my interests with technology and developing new works and new technologies. So there's this cliche saying that great edits in film happen when you blink. And that's actually not true at all. But it sort of started as it gave a starting point for myself and fellow PhD candidate at DX Arts at the University of Washington, a point to start creating an algorithmically produced film that was only edited when I blinked. So we approached the project using EEG technology as a neurofeedback device. And the project's title is Prosthesis Memoria for Two Performers and EEG. And like I said, it was a collaboration between myself and Daniel Peterson, who is a composer. So we started off thinking, well, if we create a film that's scored, edited, completely assembled, all in real time, purely based on our sort of physiological and neurological responses to each other's works, what might happen? So it uses that EEG technology as a neurofeedback device to compose that performance. essentially, we took this signal and we divided up all of these different neurological responses, things that were like P300s, also noise signals. The blink is actually a noise signal in an EEG, but it's really easy to trace because you get this like high amount of energy, so you can see this very distinct spike every time you blink. So we were like, wow, that's really easy to track. We can just pull that out. And we did a bunch of computation to be able to filter all of this data because we really wanted to make meaningful interactions with the data. A lot of EEG works tend to just use it as a noise signal, and we really wanted to make repeatable, a repeatable instrument that we could learn to play and work with and compose with. So we tracked a bunch of these neurological activities and also our overall neurological energy, like our neural energy that was happening. And then we coded those into control variables. So Dan's neurological activity would control the audio composition and the sound spatialization. And we utilized this technique that's known as ambisonics, which is essentially a 3D audio technique. If you think of the idea of a hologram, right, in light, where you have this holistic view of something, ambisonics is the mathematical principles and techniques that allow us to recreate that in sound. So you can recreate a soundscape from a single point that's perfectly aligned with the soundscape that it was captured in. So utilizing that technique, we're able to move the sounds through space based on our neural activity. But he's only experiencing my visual output, the output that I'm creating. He's isolated. He can't actually hear his own work that he's producing. Meanwhile, I'm on the other side of that. I'm listening and experiencing the sound composition, but I'm not actually engaged with the visual output that I'm creating. And the performance literally just begins by tapping straight into these individual sets of memories. And what we approached it thinking about all of the prosthetic memories that we gather as creatures. And for us, me, a filmmaker, and Dan, a composer, that's the archives and archives of footage or field recordings, sound compositions. And we took all of that data and we decided we wanted to filter through that in real time. And we were able to categorize them and then call different sets of data depending on those compositional control variables. So we started off tapping straight into this disjointed collection of stuff, all of that digital stuff that we create. And as the piece sort of progressed, we tried to build tension and gain some moments of cohesive clarity within the work. And we were able to achieve that essentially by networking both of our neurological activities together and creating basically a feedback loop between our two brains. We've got a little demo that I'll play you guys and let you check out. Get the sound up a little bit. Everything okay back there? Everybody good?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Just a little dark back here.
Yeah, this is a little dark. No worries. So we ran into a host of computational problems with that project. As you can imagine, we were going through, especially on my side, terabytes and terabytes of data in real time. But we did develop some pretty interesting tool sets and a bunch of interesting experiments. And this sort of is an ongoing endeavor. As computational speeds and resources get faster and faster, we're able to do more and more with this project. But essentially, one artist's memories are being explored by their own neurological response to the other artist's memories. So it's kind of a fun project. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some more recent works. And I often use the camera or the eye of the camera to expose sites that are overlooked, that are invisible, that are ignored or unseen. And a project that was completed last year, Subterra, actually turns that eye onto infrastructure. So as creatures, we've spent an extremely high amount of energy and resources developing systems of infrastructure that support our society. But as time passes, these sublime interventions that we've created sort of fade from our collective memory. But paradoxically, we are more and more reliant on those systems. And this work, I really wanted to seek out some of these creations that balance and deliver resources. And these resources are really what maintain our societal operation and stability. And I started out exploring this 100-year-old plus steam power plant. And the facility, of course, has shifted and grown over time. But it now supplies utilities, hot water, heating, cooling, power, data, to over 200 structures. And this is all possible because of this expansive labyrinth of underground tunnels, underground utility tunnels. And it's over 11 miles of tunnels I was able to gain access to and spend some time within this subterrestrial world of concrete and steel, of steam and heat, of darkness and of light. And it was this really unique experience to be within those places because the conditions within those tunnels are wildly different. Some of them are very well lit, maybe a little bit warm, kind of like a nice warm room. But others are very wet, very dark, and 120 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. And I was able to gain access and move through these spaces with a full Steadicam system and about 30 pounds of camera equipment kind of navigating deep underground, which was quite an interesting experience. So these are just a few images and film stills from both the power plant proper and that expansive labyrinth of tunnels. And the work itself actually exists as a 3-channel installation. So you have 3 different films kind of that are all composed together, as well as that 3D audio technique ambisonic score that goes along with it. So let's talk a little bit about Silent Forest. And Silent Forest was originally one of the first chapters of my Echo project. And it was kind of this non-narrative reflection that explores the aural phenomenon of these spaces that are in flux, these changing spaces. And it existed as an expanded cinema project, and I was looking at these delicate wetland environments, most of which were in the Mississippi Alluvial Plain, so sort of up and down that area. And I really wanted to focus on the industrial commercial enterprises that surround it and have a direct impact on those spaces. So there are a couple of things that happen sonically to an ecosystem right before that often signal change or that something may not be a healthy ecosystem. And one of those first things are that environmental factors, pollution, fire, radioactivity, disaster, whether it's man-made or natural, they force out or kill off all the inhabitants of that space, both on a micro and a macro scale. And within a short time, the forest will fall silent. No sounds of birds, no mammals, no insects. And you're standing there surrounded by the natural world, and yet the biophony or the sounds that are the natural sounds of that space, they've changed. Or even worse, they've completely disappeared. And the second is there are a lot of these spaces that are kind of threshold spaces, these in-between spaces that are sort of between the natural space and the design space or the civilized space. And that space is constantly vibrating and under sonic assault, right? You're standing there in that that natural environment, but yet that sound of anthrophony, or the sounds that are generated by mankind, they reverberate ever closer. And those are often markers that something in that ecosystem is about to change. So all of the raw materials for the original project were captured within over several investigative expeditions into the region, and this started several years ago. And we spent most of our time filming in wetlands, cypress swamps, lowlands, and rivers. And we also captured all of the project sounds in those landscapes, but also in active industrial spaces, transportation routes, development sites, large-scale manufacturing, places like steel mills and things like that, that all had a direct impact or are in those regions and affect those environments. And for a lot of that original footage was all filmed from either a kayak or standing like kind of chest deep, wading in those kind of wonderful waters of the wetlands. It was a really wonderful, it's a location that it kind of tugs at my heartstrings quite a bit. And for me, cinema, image making, expanded cinema, sound, all of these materials are really truly sculptural, physical materials. And they're very much a spatial medium. When you're thinking of cinema, you think of it as a window into space, right? You're navigating this alternative space. You're taking the viewer to that location. And for me, as an artist working within these, I like to try to bring some of that into the space, especially in the expanded cinema projects, whether that's through the use of sound and that spatial sound technique where I can move sound throughout space or orchestrate different aspects of a composition in different areas in the installation, or it's through scale and it's through immersion. But the work itself existed as a single channel film with an ambisonic score and a physical installation. And physically, that was basically a very large screen and a large reflection made from mill scale. Now, mill scale is a granular byproduct of the steel making process. And along with slag, that's another byproduct of that steel making process, which is actually what's featured in the sculpture here. Both of these end up in all sorts of places through construction, agriculture, infrastructure. A lot of that byproduct gets repurposed. And depending on the materials that they were creating in the process and how it was handled, that stuff can actually be extremely toxic. For the most part, it's completely safe and responsibly used. But like many of the products or byproducts that we produce as a species, it's kind of spread all over the world. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, just how invasive our species really is with the things that we create. So recently, I started going back to all of these places. I started returning to the sites of the original project. And this is now several years later. And on returning to the wetlands, I still find that landscape to be really astonishing. And yet, there's this sort of air of change. There's this palpable feeling of change within those spaces. And some of that is, of course, reflections of smaller cycles of ebb and flow of that natural ecosystem. But there are larger changes that will remain permanent and that are really only now evident to me through my images that I originally took and my memories of those sites. And the project that's opening here is actually a reflection on those relationships. It's both footage from the original project, but also images taken just a short time ago in those spaces. And this act of return or going back to sites, spaces, is something that often comes up within my work because it's about building a relationship with those sites that you're investigating. And I think it's something that will continue to sort of happen in my projects as I move forward. But I thought now would be kind of a great time to open the floor for some discussion if you guys have some questions. And I hope you all will join us to see the Jones talk later this afternoon and the opening reception tonight. So let me get a little extra light kicking back at you guys so I can see some of you. But are there any questions? No? No? Yes.
The last photo you just had up, that white line across the trees, is that a flood line?
Yes, so this specific set that we're at here, that's the flood line. That's actually the normal water line in that space. But because it's a relief area, they can control that actual water height. So it's drastically different. That original photograph of me in the kayak is actually that same stand of trees. So it varies quite wildly, but in the last couple of years, the way they've engineered it, it's really dropped the level in that whole region quite a bit.
Is that a protected site?
This is a protected site, yes. It is protected. It's adjacent to a protected site, so it's protected-ish, we'll say. Yeah.
So the photos that you took of like the steam factory, whatever.
Yeah, the power plant.
When you were taking those photos, did you intend for it to be like sort of a to give the audience more of a tense anxiety type feel? Yeah,
the naturally that type of a space tends to develop anxiety within us. And as someone who was standing in that location, I can honestly say if I hadn't had a guide from the power plant, it would have been very, very stressful because at some points 90, 100, 200 feet underground, and everything kind of looks exactly the same, and it kind of is this never-ending, almost maze of construction, which can be quite unnerving to the viewer. Definitely, yeah.
So it's interesting because you are documenting human interventions into this natural landscape and kind of, asking us, or it seems to be asking us to contemplate on that intervention. But you also explore those interventions as not just input for your work, but as an actual tool in creating your work. And so I was just wondering if that for you is a tension, or if you could just talk about the fact that you both, observe the effect of humans and technology on the environment, but you also are an avid consumer and creator with those tools. If you can talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. I find that there's always a tension there between those relationships. And I find that as artists, it's really important to be an active participant in the development and the moving forward of the mediums that you're interested in, but also of the things that we engage with as a species, and how can we balance sort of our ambitions with also being responsible and making sure that we're moving forward in a responsible way. And I think that's a constant sort of needle that bounces back and forth, and without having open discussion about it, we will never be able to balance those two things out. So that's one of the things I do want to sort of call into attention and to think about. Yeah, it's a constantly sort of thinking about process for me, definitely. All right, well, there are no other questions. I guess we are pretty well good to go.
All right, thank you.